Se oye la lluvia en los techos de cartón. Qué triste.
El Salvador is a small country situated in Central America. It was a state formerly colonized by Spain before its freedom in 1821. It then became a single sovereign body in 1832 and has since had a very unstable government filled with corruption, violence, and a struggle for power. Civil war erupted in El Salvador beginning in 1980 and lasting for 12 years until a peace agreement was reached in 1992. The government used its armed forces to enforce its authority and violence, while the people who opposed the government formed an alliance called the FMNL, or the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, which led to a very violent war, with more than 70,000 casualties. For reference, El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America and only second smallest in all of Latin America. Both the United States and Cuba played big roles in militarizing the country's armed forces and guerrilla. The FMNL was named after Farabundo Martí because he represented social justice and independence after he was executed without trial for leading an uprising against the oligarchy in power at the time. Martí was a communist intellectual, which meant that the FMNL were often referenced as having ties to communism. Because of their ties to communism, Cuba stepped in and offered their Cuban resources to help train the guerrillas to overthrow the Salvadoran government. Cuba and U.S. relations were tense at this time, and the U.S.'s attitude toward communism made matter even worse. Because of the Cold War, which was occurring at the same time as the Salvadoran War, the U.S. containment policy was enacted, which meant that stopping the spread of communism and spreading democracy was one of the highest priorities, even higher than human rights. The violence that occurred in El Salvador during these 12 years was unimaginable. It was reported that the FMNL caused less civilian casualties than the military, because their main focus was to free the people of a corrupt government, not to harm them. From the perspective of the Salvadorian people, however, both sides were largely to blame for the massive graves that were having to be dug at the time. Unfortunately, my family knows firsthand how quickly the violence and tension was growing in El Salvador at this time. My parents were part of the 25% of El Salvador's population that fled to other countries during the war in a migration called La Guinda. However, the first year of the war, my parents did have to go through. My father recalled one time when he was at a friend's house that the army stopped by and they asked for food. At that time, refusing to help the military was a very sure way to get killed. So him and his friend quickly gathered up what they could and served it to the army. Not long after serving the army, an informant runs up to the army and lets them know that the guerrilla is closing in. The army scatters, and the guerrilla now come up to the home where my father and his friend are. My father and his friend are then required once more to feed a whole other army, or suffer the consequences of refusing them food. This is one first-hand account of many, where the violence did not just begin and end with the Salvadorian army, but that continued and consumed the other side of the army, that is, the FMNL, which they were supposed to be fighting for injustice and the liberation of its people, but also were in the violence as well. The FMNL actually began with strong ties to Catholicism. Church attendance on Sunday morning in El Salvador were at a very steady and high rates leading up to the Civil War. The church, including the priests, were held at extremely high standards in the communities. So much so that the church often got involved in politics, and the people would rally behind whatever politics and politicians the church thought were morally uncorrupted. The Catholic Church consistently endorsed the Christian Democratic Party because of its pacifism and morality. Archbishop Oscar Romero became the face of the revolution leading up to the Civil War due to his pleas to the military to disobey orders that were contrary to the law of God. Archbishop Romero was having such an influence on the population that he was actually murdered by the Salvadoran government, which became the tipping point to begin the start of the Civil War. After the Archbishop's murder, every group that opposed the government came together under the umbrella of the FMNL in unity. After 12 years of violence, two influential and powerful opposing governments, and a lifetime of migration, El Salvador pulled through the war and started a period of peace. The damage had already been done, though. Hundreds of thousands of people were displaced, murdered, or irreparably damaged due to the war. Children had been robbed of their innocence, families were torn apart, and people were forever separated from the only home they had ever known. This was all fueled in part by two powerhouse countries fighting for third-party power to continue their own ideals of egocentrism.
Del explotador.